All right, let's dive into one of the most powerful and, let's be honest, controversial books ever written. We're talking about a book that didn't just tweak a few scientific ideas, it fundamentally changed how we see ourselves and everything around us. This is the story of Charles Darwin's game-changing masterpiece on the origin of species. But here's something you might not know. The book's full, original title. Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's also incredibly revealing. Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Whoa. That phrase right there tells you this isn't just some boring catalog of plants and animals. No, it's about a constant, competitive process that actively shapes the entire living world.
And the engine driving this struggle for life, it's a little something called natural selection. Now, this is super important. It's not about being the strongest or the fastest or the biggest in some general sense. It's all about being the best fit for your specific neighborhood. If an organism has a trait that gives it just a tiny advantage, it's more likely to survive, have kids, and pass that winning lottery ticket of a trait on. It's such a simple concept, but the consequences are absolutely massive.
So you have to imagine the world before Darwin. The incredible variety of life on Earth was what he called the mystery of mysteries. Most scientists back then figured that all species were just, poof, created as they are, fixed and unchanging. But Darwin came along with this radical new idea, a logical way to explain how all this amazing diversity could just happen naturally, given enough time, a lot of time. And the beautiful thing is, he built his case like a detective, using clues that were hiding in plain sight. He laid it out logically. First, he observed that creatures make way more babies than can possibly survive. But, fact 2, populations are mostly stable. And fact 3, resources like food are limited. So, what does that lead to? A struggle to exist. Add in the fact that individuals vary and that those variations can be passed down, and boom! Any tiny variation that helps you win that struggle is more likely to stick around. That's it. That's the argument.
Now here's where it gets really mind-bending. If you follow that process backwards, logically, it means every living thing on this planet is related. We all share a common ancestor. The only illustration in his entire book wasn't a ladder with humans at the top. It was this, a branching tree. Some branches grow and split, others get trimmed off by extinction. It means you're not just related to a chimpanzee. You're related to the pigeon outside your window and the oak tree down the street. We're all part of the same family tree.
So, Darwin has this world-changing idea in his back pocket. You'd think he'd be shouting it from the rooftops, right? Well, not exactly. The story of how this book finally got published is a real nail-biter, full of decades of quiet research and then a sudden, desperate sprint to the finish line. Get this. Darwin had the basics of his theory figured out in the late 1830s, but he just sat on it for almost 20 years, just collecting more and more evidence. Then, in 1858, a bombshell. Another naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, sends him a paper from halfway across the world, and it describes the exact same theory. Can you imagine? This lit a fire under Darwin. They presented their work together, and Darwin rushed to get his big book out. And the public? They were ready. The first printing sold out the same day. And when I say the reaction was a firestorm, I'm not exaggerating. This book exploded. It was debated absolutely everywhere, not just in science labs, but in churches, in newspapers, over dinner. It kicked a hornet's nest of questions about creation, our special place in the world, and everything people thought was solid and true. It wasn't just another book. It was a cultural earthquake. But here's where the story takes a really dark turn. Because, like a lot of powerful ideas, Darwin's theory was hijacked. It was twisted and distorted to justify things he never, ever intended, leading to a dangerous ideology that cast a very long, very dark shadow. Okay, so we need to draw a big, thick, permanent marker line between Darwin's science and the political garbage that was social Darwinism. They are not the same thing. Darwin was explaining biology, how animals and plants adapt. Social Darwinists ripped that idea out of context and slapped it onto human society to justify things like the rich are naturally better than the poor, or that some races were superior. It was a perversion of science used to defend brutal power structures. And here's the kicker. That famous phrase everyone knows, survival of the fittest, it wasn't Darwin's. It was coined by a philosopher named Herbert Spencer, who was a huge fan of social Darwinism. Now, Darwin did add it to a later edition of his book, saying it was a decent summary of natural selection, but the phrase's origins are squarely in politics and social theory, not biology. And the real-world consequences of this twisted ideology were horrific.
It gave a fake scientific stamp of approval to some of the ugliest chapters of history. We're talking colonialism, scientific racism, and the eugenics movement, which is a truly horrifying story for another day. It was, plain and simple, the weaponization of a scientific idea.
So here we are, more than 160 years later, and the shockwaves from Origin of Species are still being felt. The original controversy is still very much alive, it just has new names and slightly different arguments.
The classic argument against evolution actually came before Darwin. It's called the watchmaker analogy. It's pretty simple. If you're walking on a beach and find a watch, you know it didn't just assemble itself out of sand. You know there was a watchmaker. Well, the argument goes, if you look at something as complex as a human eye, doesn't that also imply there must have been a designer?
That old argument has a modern-day descendant, and it's called irreducible complexity. This is a central idea in the intelligent design movement. The basic concept is that some biological systems are like a perfectly built machine. They have all these different parts that are essential, and if you take even one of them away, the whole thing doesn't just work poorly, it stops working completely.
The classic example everyone uses for this is a simple mousetrap. You know, you've got the wooden base, the spring, the hammer, the catch. Take any one of those pieces away, and what do you have? Not a bad mousetrap, you have a useless pile of parts. So the argument is, how could natural selection build that one tiny step at a time if none of the intermediate steps would work?
So what's the scientific response to that? Well, it's that evolution is a brilliant tinkerer, not an engineer with a blueprint. Parts that are absolutely essential for a system now might have evolved to do a completely different job millions of years ago. Evolution is fantastic at grabbing an old part and finding a new use for it. So a system can be built piece by piece, as parts that were once just a nice bonus become totally essential later on. But okay, beyond the back and forth arguments, Darwin's theory made a huge, testable prediction. If his tree of life is real, the evidence should be written in our DNA. And with modern genetics, we can check. And it turns out, he was spot on. If you look at a critical protein that most living things have, the number of genetic differences matches the tree of life perfectly. We're one letter different from a rhesus monkey, but 45 letters different from yeast. It's a genetic echo of common ancestry.
Ultimately, a lot of this debate, especially when it comes to what's taught in science class, boils down to a really basic question. What actually counts as science? This definition, which comes from a major U.S. court case, lays out the rules of the game. Science has to be based on natural law. It has to be testable. It has to be falsifiable. That's a key one, meaning there has to be some way you could prove it wrong. And its conclusions are always provisional, always open to change with new evidence. That's the framework.
So just think about it. An idea that started with a naturalist jotting down notes in the 1800s, went on to redefine biology, spark over a century of fierce debate, got twisted to justify oppression, and still today challenges some of our deepest beliefs. It's an incredible story, and it proves that a truly great scientific theory doesn't just give us answers, it forces us to ask much bigger and much better questions about who we really are.